my son is 6.5. He's in kindy in school, mainstream school. He's been supported by the integrated funding from Department of Education. My question is, when the NDIS kicks in, does this NDIS write off the funding from the Department of Education? But they're either saying that that funding going to disappear, so it's just a rumour, so I want to know, because that's going to be impacting the school, the way of the school supporting my son.
One of the things that's creating a little bit of, fear, the fact that ADDIC and FACS is exiting procurement and delivery of disability services. So by 2019, the department that Janice is talking about won't be there in the same way it is now. That doesn't mean that all of the other government departments, education, health, and so on, don't need to continue their role in disability.
We've actually been watching some documentation go up where it talks very clearly about what the role of what would be the responsibility of the NDIA, what will be the responsibility of health, and what will be the responsibility of education. That document's not signed off as yet, but certainly that will give hopefully some really most probably clearer guidelines than what we've had around before over whose responsibility is. Now, there's no way in the world that they're going to withdraw, support workers in schools. That is the Department of Education's role. The difference will be is that your child will be eligible and receive a package, and then you might decide that you want some additional supports in school for those key transitional points, or you might think the teacher that I've actually got actually needs a little bit of capacity building, and that's some of the role of the Department of Education, but the early intervention providers can come in and do some of that as well.
It's sort of twofold. One is whether resources will be included in package. So for people like myself with a child on FAXIA funding, that had a services and a resources component. So the question is, what happens to the resources component? The second question is for children who are going through school and are going from one particular schooling environment to another. Like at the moment, my son's at a school that has a lot of therapy services, but in a year or two's time, he probably won't have that. Is there an annual review process? Because the package that I'd need for him would substantially change once he leaves that particular school. So just understanding how that will work.
Support planning happens when you need it to happen, basically. So we know, especially with kids, that there are key transitional points where the needs of the child will change. And at that point, then you call on your support planner to go back and get your services reassessed. The same as if a person was in an accommodation service and their health might be failing and therefore they needed more support, so they may have been on one package, they go back to the support planner and get that reassessed to make sure that it meets the goals that you have for your child, so that there is an outcome at the end of the day. Some of it, some things like because you can't access transport readily for your child because there's an expectation that you'll do that, but if you need special equipment in your car, then yes, that is covered under the NDIS. So it's done on a case-by-case basis.
It was more the genuine sensory-based tools that you use to help a child cope in a classroom and cope at home and those sorts of things.
Under the NDIS, they'll look at the cost of your services and say, okay, how might we do that better? And the agency has enough flexibility to horse trade between different parts of the package in order to achieve a better long-term outcome. So that sort of thing, it would be very difficult to achieve under the current block funding environment, whereas that's specifically what the NDIS is designed to do.
The NDIS has just released a paper, or it's actually a strategy, on assistive technology. So for anyone whose child requires assistive technology for in their daily life, or anything, so that helps them going to school or playing sport or being part of just doing family things that every other family does, you will be eligible for supports under that as well.
My daughter was diagnosed with autism 10 years ago, and I have an assessment report. But when I attended an information session at another place, they told me that for entry into NDIS, I need an assessment report that is less than 2 years old. So I'm quite confused whether I need to do another assessment for my daughter or the report that is five years ago is sufficient.
There is some confusion that people think that they need to go out now and get an assessment for their family member. Now, that's in most cases not necessary. So one of the reasons why, if you already have good information and you already have a connection with people that can provide supports for you around accessing the future supports, there's every reason to think that you will receive the supports that you need to support your family member if it's necessary and reasonable. But the point of the new system is that we want to get away from the old system where once upon a time that you had to have a reassessment every time you want a new service and you had to meet some new eligibility. Once you're eligible to enter the scheme at the different levels of entry, that's it, you remain eligible for the rest of your life. The services that you might receive over your lifetime, over the following 40 years or so, might change in that time to meet your life needs at that point in time, but it's not a continuing reassessment. We don't want people rushing out to get assessment that just isn't necessary, and I'm pleased to say that most providers I talk to recognise that and understand that. The department has said quite clearly that if the person is already in receipt of any funded services in New South Wales, for example, residential care or day programs, then they don't need to be reassessed. They will become automatically eligible. And I believe in New South Wales it's 42,000 people automatically eligible to transition from July 1 next year. So those people won't need to go through reassessment, and that's going to reduce a significant period of time both for individuals and families and make it much easier to transition through, and you will receive very much what you're already receiving currently when you go across the line come July 1 next year.
My son has Down syndrome and is currently receiving, or has been receiving, the Better Start funding. The support that I've used, the things I've used to support him in that has been private therapy services in the form of speech therapy and occupational therapy. We've pretty much almost used all of our funding. He's only 4.5, and I'm just wondering, I've heard you talk about Better Start and FAXIA rolling into the NDIS. I'm wondering if we have actually run out of funding, where we stand come the rollout in July 1, if we're still able to apply, I suppose, to continue with his private therapy sessions, which I feel he very much needs.
There is funding available for people who require support, require therapeutic support, so that's what ADDIC's been funding. In terms of Better Start and FAXIA, that funding has had a limited time frame. It also had limited amounts. The Better Start funding and the Helping Children with Autism funding, which came from the Commonwealth Government, was time limited and funds limited. In what's happening and what's happened in the Hunter and across Australia is in terms of that funding, where there's been outstanding amounts, that outstanding amount has been rolled into the young child's package, and there are line items in the new service costing and pricing, the services available under the NDIS, that actually cover therapy supports. But as Jan said, there's a much bigger move these days to what's called a transdisciplinary approach. So a number of therapists will work with that family, developing strategies to work for the family and the other people who are significant in that child's life to support that child. There is space under the NDIS where private practitioners have registered to provide support, and so there is capacity. There will be capacity when this region rolls into the NDIS for private practitioners to register with the NDIA and continue to providing support.
You only need to register as a provider if the people that you're going to be supporting have chosen to leave their funds with the NDIA. If you decide as a family that you want to self-manage your funding and take that with you, you can spend that money wherever you deem fit. It doesn't have to be a registered provider. So to your example, you determining that your best need is to use your local private speech therapist. Again, that's exactly what the NDIS is aimed at, and essentially what we're doing is giving everybody that opportunity.
I've got a 14-year-old son, and just going back, there's two sort of questions related to equipment. You're talking about now that you can go and get equipment when you need. So, for instance, my son's in the process of getting a wheelchair. What's happening with organisations like Enable? Because we're starting and we know it's an 18-month wait to get one, and he's desperate for one now. Do we still go through the whole process and wait, or do we wait for the NDIS to come in and wait for his wheelchair then, because he's already grown out of it? And so the second question was, in terms of you're talking about the therapies and things, you're saying that a lot of it will move over, but will they individually assess the child and the therapy that they need? Because, for instance, he's got cerebral palsy and hasn't had much therapy, even though he desperately needs it because of funding within the CPA. So then he can sort of, they'll look at it and say he needs the therapy, and then he can choose what he needs. Is that how it works?
They won't assess you at a detailed sort of level to work out which specific therapies you need. It'll be about determining, given the level of severity of his CP, what is the ballpark reasonableness that in terms of the funding and the approach within the agency that they should be able to support, and then it'll be up to you to decide which goals and which objectives you want to focus that funding on, and that will change obviously over his lifetime.
I would continue to proceed through Enable. We know sometimes that is difficult and it is a long process, but I think you still need to do it because we're still a way off you being able to access that through NDIS.
The scheme funds reasonable and necessary. They're an insurance company. Imagine you're ringing a Bupa or a Medibank or someone like that. So they'll be quite harsh about what reasonable and necessary means. They don't fund awesome and good. They fund reasonable and necessary. For example, they won't fund if you want to go to Fiji and do an experimental disability course. They won't fund dolphin therapy because there's no evidence that works. But what they will fund, let's say if you want a wheelchair, the average waiting period at the moment for a good wheelchair is about 18 months in some cases. That's not going to be there anymore. Because they'll fund you to go and get your wheelchair from a supplier. The supplier or the organisation might help you with that. And so I expect, for example, that 18-month waiting list to disappear fairly quickly. Those sorts of things are going to be, at a practical level, what the impact is like. There was a lot of press initially about people worried about the scheme being focused on physical disabilities. Again, that's not true. Most of the people in the scheme at the moment don't have a physical disability. It's intellectual disability and autism making up about 60% of the scheme at the moment.
We're doing a lot of work to make sure that when the NDIS funding comes in and you're able to get out, that the community is going to be ready. There's a lot of work we're doing with corporate Australia and with governments across Australia to make our communities more accessible and more inclusive. And it's all being embedded. I think in the next 5 years there's going to be a huge change in the built environment and the way it works for people with both physical and behavioural disabilities. So we're really excited to be part of that.